There we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Monica McCouprie. I am the Wildlife Education Specialist with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. And today we're going to be talking about the science of flying squirrels. So like I mentioned, this is something that not everyone knows that we have, which is kind of also neat because it's like a hidden, elusive, secretive animal. And so we're going to talk all about them today. So I'll go ahead and share my screen so that people can see. I also apologize. There might be a lot of people walking by. I will do my best to kind of keep that noise out. We have a commission meeting today and sometimes it's kind of loud. So, all right. So science of flying squirrels. So we're going to be, like I mentioned, talking about flying squirrels. We don't have a ton of them in Nebraska. There's also a lot of places where we're lacking a lot of data. So not even just in our state, but they're more of an eastern range. A lot of people in the eastern United States kind of talk about, they see them all the time at bird feeders, or they see them quite frequently. That's a little bit different than in Nebraska, but we'll talk about the differences and why that might be. All right, so if you haven't joined a virtual Game and Parks program, I just want to let everybody know, please ask questions. Please comment on things. A lot of you that have been on here before, you're always very helpful. If someone has a question and you know the answer, know how to find it, you help, and I really appreciate that. Just make sure that we're talking about things and we're being relevant and staying on topic to today's thing of flying squirrel. Otherwise, we do have that right to remove you from the program. And then I also want to point out that I am by no means an expert in flying squirrels. I do a lot of research for these programs. I am an expert in science communication. So that is my job that I've been doing for the last 11 years. I love science. I feel like I do a pretty good job of communicating that to the public. But if you ask questions that I don't know, I will find someone that does know the answer and I will get back to you. So. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about flying squirrels. We're going to talk about what are they? What are they related to? Are they rodents? Do they fly? All of those things. So whoops. All right. So flying squirrels, when we break it down, there's more than 50 species and we call them gliding squirrels. So their name kind of falsely advertises what they actually do. So no mammal except for bats truly fly. So bats are the only animals or mammals that are capable of true flight. We know that birds fly, insects fly. Mammals, it's only bats. So when we say flying squirrels, we really mean gliding squirrels. So there's 3 species that are in North America. 2 of those are in northern Eurasia. And then we also have all the others, flying squirrels out of that 50. They're found in temperate and kind of tropical forests of India and places like Asia. So they're kind of all over the place. But there are 3 species here in North America. They are in the rodent family. So they are just kind of a different type of squirrel. So squirrels are considered rodents. How do you know if something is in the rodent family? There's a very large morphological differences. There's a lot of ecological differences. When you look at something like a beaver, a porcupine, a squirrel, a mouse, all of those things are in the rodent family and they're very different from each other. One of the main things that makes them rodents, though, they have something in common, is they have their dentition, or their teeth are very similar. They might be different sizes, but they're very similar throughout that rodent family. So they're very specialized in gnawing or chewing on things. I'm sure most of us have heard that rodents like beavers, they chew on things because they're basically wearing their teeth down. So they're constantly growing. So squirrels are no different. They're rodents and they constantly chew on things. All right, so like I mentioned, flying squirrels, they don't actually fly, but they glide. So there's been records of 1,500 feet spans, that's huge, of them actually gliding over the trees. And then Nebraska is home to one species of flying squirrel and is called the southern flying squirrel. All right, so there's been a few people what's the difference between a sugar glider and a fox squirrel and a flying squirrel? So they look kind of similar to each other. There are some people in Nebraska that have sent in pictures of these guys. So these are sugar gliders. They're not native to Nebraska. A lot of people, not a lot of people, but some people have them as pets. These are ones that kind of will sit in those little hammocks. A lot of people show them in the hammocks, but these guys are not native, like I mentioned. They're in the same family. They look very similar. Sugar gliders are always going to have that stripe on the front of their face. So if you ever see one of these in the wild, it is probably an escaped pet, which some of them have been in Nebraska. It happens, or sometimes, as we know, people let them go, which is not great for the environment, but it does happen. So here's what a sugar glider looks like. And then I'm sure all of us have seen a squirrel. The most common squirrel, at least that we have here in Nebraska, is going to be your fox squirrel. So they're kind of that reddish, rusty color. But if you notice, their face looks very similar to a sugar glider, which also looks very similar to a flying squirrel. So here's our flying squirrel, our southern flying squirrel that we have in Nebraska. They have the large eyes. They have the same type of face and body structure, all in the same family, but they're just going to be a little different from each other. So I wanted to make sure that we got that, to kind of show the differences between all of those. All right, so physical description, like what do they look like? So very similar to a squirrel that you would see in your yard. They have long limbs, they're very slender, and these guys have huge eyes. So they are nocturnal. So again, having those large pupils, they need to let in as much starlight, as much moonlight, as much light as there is out in the wilderness at nighttime. They need that so that they can see. So these guys, they have that long, very bushy tail. It's often cylindrical in shape or sometimes flattened, kind of like a rudder on a boat. They have very dense fur, very soft. Sometimes it's either silky in texture or it can kind of feel like a woolly texture. And then there's there's pretty considerable body range sizes. So between all of the species that are in North America and in the world, they vary in size. But in Nebraska, the body length is about 12 to 24 inches. The tail, as you can see in a lot of these pictures, is quite a bit of that body length. But again, that helps them glide through the trees. All right. Here is a video. This is not one that we have in Nebraska, but it was the best video that I could find. Just kind of observing what they do. There is no sound on this, just so that everybody knows, but they're cute. You can see that cylindrical tail. This one's really bushy. You can see their kind of flattened ears. Their large eyes, in my opinion, they're like, not creepy, but dang, those eyes are very large. So again, letting in as much light as possible, being that nocturnal creature that they are. All right, so that was pretty much the video. Again, not that great. As you can imagine, they're very elusive. Game and Parks has a few photos, but they're very hard to get photos of. So later, towards the end of the program, I will be asking maybe for some of your help. All right, so evolutionary history. Where do these guys come from? How do they evolve? So it's not really well known. We have a few perspectives. We have a few theories. But most of the identification that scientists have done or classifiers have done is basically looking at their dental features. And we mentioned earlier that is a huge characteristic of those rodents. They have this special little area in their mouth called a diastema. If you look, it's like a space or a gap. So they have their incisors, there's a space or a gap in their skull, and then they have their molars and their premolars. Looking at these features, it's not unique to them, but it does help identify these squirrels. And basically the fossils attributed to this clade, the squirrels or flying squirrels, may have indeed also belonged to other squirrels. So it's kind of hard to place exactly where they came up in this evolutionary history. But the oldest fossil of a squirrel that has been found is 11.6 million years old. We can see that they share gliding diagnostic features by the forms that are still here today. So we can kind of see that they haven't really changed a lot. For the most part, in about 12 million years, they've stayed very similar. They've experienced very little morphological change or like the physicality of them changing. So basically the origin of flying squirrels, most of them, I let people in here. Most of them, the genetic studies point towards the group splitting from tree squirrels, like the ones that we see here in Nebraska about 23 million years ago. The oldest remains mostly in those cheek teeth. So looking at them, they kind of suggest that about 36 million years ago, they started soaring through the trees. But then the oldest fossil that we found is only 11.6. So I found a lot of different theories and ideas about how they kind of changed over time. So the thing that I could find really is that no one can agree where they came from. But looking at the teeth and looking at the squirrels, they believe that they came from an ancestor of a tree squirrel, which is what we see mostly in Nebraska. All right, so southern flying squirrels. Nebraska, this is the species that we have. So the southern flying squirrel, they're commonly found in subtemperate deciduous or kind of mixed forests. They're slightly smaller than the northern flying squirrel, and they're predominantly found in the eastern half of the United States. And Nebraska is kind of their most like northern and like eastern range. So we barely get the tip, just kind of the southeastern portion of Nebraska is where we can find them. They just start to come into Nebraska. So that's why they're a threatened species, is we just don't have a ton of them. But they're commonly found in like a beech maple, oak hickory, poplar forest, kind of a mix between those. And then they nest in tree cavities or nests made of leaves. So they also like abandoned woodpecker nests, bird and squirrels, and then a lot of people actually put up nest boxes. There's been quite a few people that have done like Boy Scout projects, or people even on East Campus here for the university have made a lot of tree boxes or nest boxes for squirrels. It just has to be like a bat house, the perfect diameter, the perfect insides, the perfect placement. So it all has to be perfect in sequential order. Otherwise, those flying squirrels are not going to use them. All right, so aside from their patagia, which is, if you can see, it's this extra kind of fur right here. It's like extra skin. It reminds me of a bulldog, like the wrinkles on a bulldog. It's right here. This is called the patagium. So that is their extra loose skin that they use to glide. So aside from that, flying squirrels look pretty similar to their ground squirrel cousins. They have the same facial features, they have whiskers, they have the same types of feet, they have those large eyes. It helps them with being nocturnal and kind of navigating the dark. The fur color kind of varies by species, also by their location. So southern flying squirrel that's found in Nebraska might look very different than one that's found in like Pennsylvania or Tennessee. The hair on the underbellies and under the nose is an off-white or kind of a creamy color. And then the front and the rear feet are the same size. However, the rear feet have 5 claws and the front feet only has 4. And overall, they have about 22 teeth. 22 teeth. Teeth. Yep. All right. So diet, huge variety diet. Mostly it just kind of depends on where they're living and also the species. Diets, again, will vary by location. It turns out that the southern flying squirrel, which is the one we have here in Nebraska, is the more carnivorous of the bunch. So northern flying squirrels, I found that they will dine on insects and seeds, nuts, and a lot of studies show that about 80% of their diet is fungi, which is neat. A lot of people don't know that animals actually eat them. So especially being in the eastern part of the country, there's a lot of different fungi species, and there's a lot of scientists that are kind of trying to show the relationships between certain types of fungi growing in certain areas and their relationship with that northern flying squirrel. So northern flying squirrels have a little bit more fungi in their diet, while the southern flying squirrel, like I mentioned, a little bit more carnivorous. They'll supplement their diet with things like insects, bird eggs. Sometimes there have been reports of them eating newly hatched birds themselves. And then also carrion is an option. So already dead animals, that's an easy meal for anything to eat. And then something, the Indo-Chinese flying squirrel, this one prefers cultivated fruit. So it's found in China and parts of southeastern Asia. So their diet, overall, they're mostly omnivorous, omnivores, but it does vary by their location as well. All right, so they are nocturnal. They're only come out at night. So the very large eyes, they have those outsized pupils on them. Like I mentioned, they're able to gather as much light as possible to see from the moon and the stars. And then they also have extra long whiskers, which they use to see at night. Fox squirrels also have them, but when you look at a picture of a fox squirrel versus a southern flying squirrel, the whiskers are way longer on the southern flying squirrel. They're the longest of any squirrel species, simply because they have to feel around at night. If you're gliding from tree to tree, you need to know what's happening and see as best as you can. And then also they are a prey species. So the placement of their eyes, they're very far to the sides of their head. So they have a very wide field of vision, which again would help them when they're gliding through things. If they're people and have a very front facing vision, that's not that helpful. So being a prey species, eyes on the side, you hide, eyes in the front, you hunt. So it kind of helps them see as they're moving through those trees. All right, reproduction. So they're mostly solitary animals. However, during those breeding seasons, they will come together. So once a female will become fertile, males gather around the female to compete for her attention. Basically, the males will kick rapidly back and forth. They'll make movements with their hindquarters. Most occurrences, the female will mate with the dominant male. If you're any kind of scientist, you probably can understand how that helps and hurts with the gene pool. So the genetic diversity sometimes isn't as strong. It's sometimes what we see with our prairie chickens as well. It's usually the dominant female with a dominant male, which is, mostly good genes. The thing is, there's not a lot of diversity. So that's a problem with our prairie chickens, sometimes very similar in places with the flying squirrels as well. There just is not that good genetic diversity. So peak time for Nebraska, they usually have 2 different cycles per year. Peak time is February and March, and then also May through July for Nebraska. Some species will only do once a year. Some species do twice a year. And then the weather severity is also going to play a factor into this and how many cycles they have every year, and also the amount of cached food. So if there's not a lot of food available, they are not going to waste their time or their energy having babies at the time. It just doesn't make sense for them. Most of them are promiscuous, so males will mate with other females, females will mate with other males. They don't mate for life or anything like that. The southern flying squirrels, when the young are born, they're born completely blind, they're hairless, they're helpless, very similar to other squirrels. Some other species are more well-developed at birth, and usually the females will care for the young. So once the male does his job, he leaves and does not help in this paternal care. And then what happens is they're weaned at about 2 months old. Like I mentioned, usually they're solitary, but sometimes they will nest together, especially during the colder months to keep that body heat. But typically it's family members, and it's really only to keep warm during those winter months. All right, their home range. Females are very territorial. Females are very territorial. They will defend both their tree and their nest, and also the surrounding areas of their home range. So they can get quite territorial. And then females and other males and females, they do not overlap in home ranges. Some species, some types of animals do that. There's no overlapping. That is their space. So if they need to, they will respond aggressively. Some of the things they can do, they will stare at you, which doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but if you've ever had a squirrel stare at you, it's interesting. They'll stamp their feet, they will lunge, they'll jump on. Sometimes they even smack other squirrels in the face if they're in their space, especially during the mating seasons. They are uber aggressive. So they're going to respond as they need to, but especially during those mating times, they're even more aggressive towards their space. All right, so sometimes some things that people don't know is, one, we even have flying squirrels in Nebraska, which we do, but they're also what we call ultrasonic. So we know for a long time how these guys have vocalized and they kind of communicate with each other, but it's ultrasonic or it's above like the what humans can hear. We're not exactly sure why. There's a few theories. It's never been demonstrated, but scientists think that they use echolocation for navigation. So it's at a different level than bats, though. So bats use it so they don't run into things, and also so that they can find their food. Southern flying squirrels, or just flying squirrels in general, people have theorized about this for a very long time, but it's never really been demonstrated. So they believe that there's some type of echolocation or ultrasonic frequencies that they use to find their way in the dark. Also to communicate with each other. So that social interaction and the pup rearing are another reason that they think that they use some type of echolocation. And then also, scientists also believe that one of their main predators is owls, no matter where they are. In the United States, their main predator is an owl, and they believe that they make these calls at that really high frequency because it's above the hearing of an owl. So there could be an owl and it thinks that it is very camouflaged and it knows nothing is there. However, there's all these flying squirrels around communicating above that owl frequency, and the owl has no idea that all the squirrels know he's there. So that's another theory, is that they think that it is because it's above the hearing of an owl. But they do make 3 main calls. There are trills, arc whistles, and what are called crows. So there's other different types, but again, just like other mammals, they have something specific for mating mating. They have something specific for pup rearing, if they're territory guarding. So there's lots of different calls that mean lots of different things. All right, another thing that a lot of people don't know is there was this guy named John Martin. He was doing a frog study on the fluorescence of frogs. So if you don't know this, quick side note, a lot of amphibians fluoresce or they glow under a certain light, which is neat. So he was out doing this frog project and in Wisconsin, and he was using this flashlight, this ultraviolet flashlight, and all of a sudden he dropped it and it accidentally shined onto a flying squirrel. And when he went to pick it up, the squirrel was glowing this bright bubblegum pink color. So this was a total accident that someone found out, but they glow under a black light. So why is this? What's the advantage for it? Not really sure. Some people think it could be a side effect of a specific compound in the squirrel's fur and that it has no adaptive value. Some people believe that it helps with camouflaging. Since owls can detect UV light, they think that they blend into things like fluorescing plants and lichens. So basically they're less of a target and it's harder for the owl or predator to see them. And then some people, which is unique among squirrel species, the lens covering the eye lets UV radiation pass through into the retina. So sometimes in the future, we don't really know, but a lot of people think this is like a yet to be understood role in that communication or that mating. So if you want to see what a squirrel looks like in the dark, flying squirrel, this is what they look like. So on the right-hand side, this is normal during the night, one that is not glowing. And then like, again, that bubblegum pink color, this is a complete accident that someone found this, but it's very, very neat. All right, so we're going to talk about their gliding feature here. Since they are called a gliding squirrel, a flying squirrel, we're going to talk about that today and exactly how they do that. All right, so the main adaptation that they have is that patagium. We mentioned this earlier. So in this flying squirrel, you can see that's kind of hunched over. It's this extra skin right here, kind of between their belly and their ankles and their wrists. So this is called that patagium. It's just an ample, loose amount of skin. It underlies the muscle, typically forming this fur-covered membrane between the forelimbs and the hind limbs. Depends on the species. Some have smaller membranes between their wrists and their ankles. Some have larger. It just all depends on the species. But there is this cartilaginous rod that extends from the wrist and it supports the front part of the membrane that goes alongside that body. So it's very critical for them to glide. So gliding squirrels, they're known to soar. Usually it's about 150 to 500 feet from tree to tree. That's normal range. But there's been more recorded ranges that 1,500 feet is the most that I could find. They do this to avoid ground predators. And then they glide rather than truly fly. They don't have a means of propulsion. So birds, bats, when they fly, they can propel themselves forward. But these guys, they will glide using that furry membrane, that patagium, and then they have an extra bunch of skin that connects to the rest of their body, very similar to if you're familiar with like a squirrel suit, like a base jumper, or that wing suit that we see a lot of people using before. That's that biomimicry. So taking something in nature and making it useful for people and in the real world. So they kind of base that off these flying squirrels, but they glide to avoid predators, and their main predator are owls. And sometimes they do have to venture to the ground, but they don't linger too long there because they're also susceptible to larger mammal predators, things like weasels, in the right areas, places like fishers, foxes, coyotes, domestic dogs, domestic cats. All of these things could eat a flying squirrel. All right, so this patagium that they have, if you're familiar with a Draco lizard, if you're not, after this, look it up. They do very similar things. They glide. So they have this extra bunch of skin that they're able to glide. They have wing-like folds of skin in a Draco called a patagium as well, and it stretches from their forearms to their hind legs. The patagium will produce lift, which allows the squirrel to glide. So very similar to how we fly in an airplane. And I mentioned earlier, there's that thin rod of cartilage that goes from the front of the organism all the way to the ankles or to the rear. All right, so how do they do this? So what they do is they also have little flaps on their skins known as winglets, very similar to when you fly on a plane. So these are helping the animal reduce drag and then also to stabilize the glide. And then all of these things, these are all still theoretical assumptions. We are not flying squirrels. No one is ever going to be a flying squirrel and then come back to the human. So we don't know for sure, but these are very good scientific guesses. This is using all the information we know and what we can theorize about it. But basically, we haven't really unraveled the mechanism that flying squirrels use to glide. But we have a pretty good idea. So this is how it works. They get a running start, very similar to if you were to jump off of something, you usually take a running start. You prepare yourself for takeoff using those components of your muscular and skeletal system. So using special bones, muscles, those tendons, ligaments, joints, all of those things are utilized in the limbs to move them as they're desired through the air. The muscles in the patagium can be tensed and loosened when they're desired to change the flight pattern. So they can actually move and change directions in the air. They can turn by lowering one arm, and then a specialized piece of cartilage that's not found in other gliding mammals. It basically extends from the wrists and it supports the patagium so that they can steer themselves through the air. All right, so steering and landing, they are capable of making 180-degree turns in midair to avoid a predator like an owl. These guys, once they're completed flying, they can rest their flattened tail. They'll point all their limbs forward, creating like this parachute effect when they're ready to land. And then they move the hands in opposite directions so they can direct their movements and land safely. And they have really, really strong but silent padded feet. So when they hit that tree or that bark or the branch, they're very silent. The first thing they will immediately do is go to the other side of the tree. This is just in case a predator saw them and is flying right up to them. So when they land, they can pounce on it. So they go immediately to the other side of the tree. Their long, fluffy tails also help stabilize their flight, and they flip the tail up basically to put on the brakes. So if they're needing a brake, they'll flip their tail up and it kind of slows them down, and then they're able to land kind of safely after that point. All right, so if you've ever seen a squirrel suit, this is what they were based off of. So this is someone that is, I think, base jumping or jumping out of a plane, I'm not sure, but the squirrel suit, you can kind of see they extend their arms very much to the sides, and then they will also use that patagium or that extra skin, kind of like that parachute effect. So when flying squirrels go to land, this is kind of what it looks like. I think flying squirrels might be a little bit more graceful, but I'm not sure. Okay, I wanted to also spend some time talking about flying squirrels here in Nebraska. So like I mentioned, there's only about 50 species throughout the world, but let's go ahead and talk about the ones that we have here in our state. So overall, what does conservation look like for flying squirrels? Almost half of all flying squirrels in the world, all species, are threatened. The only thing that's really hard to say, as I mentioned this earlier, is that they're very elusive. Even here at Game and Parks, where we have someone that studies them, we have very few pictures of them. We have very little data. And so it's hard to get that data for a lot of species. So we're, again, making very scientific guesses on a lot of things, but a lot of those species we know are threatened. Some even have decreasing populations. There's one called the smoky flying squirrel, which is found in Asia. The deforestation and agricultural land development, there's a lot of hunting of this animal and also trapping of this animal. So there are some that have a very, very steep decline in their population. Some are doing fine, some are threatened. So it's kind of just across the board. It just kind of depends on where they're found. But as far as Nebraska, they're pretty common in eastern states. I hear there's a lot of people that show pictures of them at a bird feeder. They see them quite frequently. The southern flying squirrel, the SFQ, sorry, SF, it should be SFS, but southern flying squirrel is considered a threatened species in our state. It's one of the few mammals that is considered threatened or endangered. They do not hibernate. So even though right now, I'm sure a lot of us with the snow, we are glad we're inside, these guys can technically still be up and active. So in Nebraska, They primarily inhabit hardwood forests along the southeastern edge of the state. This is like the Missouri River Forest, Indian Cave Bluffs, and Rouleau Bluff landscapes. If you're not from Nebraska, if you imagine our state and you look at the very southeast corner, that is where their native home range is for Nebraska. So these guys, like I mentioned, especially during this cold time, they're going to remain in their nests for several days, kind of blocking out and just riding through this severe weather, and then they will form those groups. It kind of is common to nest together to conserve that warmth, but mostly it's those family members that we talked about. All right, there are some people, there's a lot of been talk on East Campus here for the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, there's been a lot of people making nest boxes for them. So some people have different thoughts about those nest boxes. Do they work? Are we using the right ones? Are we actually attracting flying squirrels? But this is what one would kind of look like if you ever see one. If you've ever hiked at Indian Cave State Park, you might see a few of these. That's what we're looking for. You also might see, they look like a cage, like a small little cage kind of stuck to a tree. That's another type of flying squirrel kind of capturing device. So we need them to get some data. We're trying to get genetic information on them. So we just don't know a lot about them. All right, so what is their population status like? The primary reason that it's threatened for Nebraska is simply because we have a very limited amount of mature hardwood deciduous forest habitat. We are a prairie state, but we do have natively, we have southern flying squirrels. We just don't have a ton of area for them to be in. So we're asking people in those areas, we need people to provide cavities for trees, for nesting, and also for protection. The whole goal is to maintain mature forests, retain dead trees, which a lot of people don't understand why we have dead trees, take them out. They're needed for a lot of species, southern flying squirrels being one of them. Or we need trees with dead limbs to offer those roosting sites and those nesting cavities. And it's not just for flying squirrels. So a lot of birds will use them, some other types of mammals will use them, insects will use them. So we've all known, like, if you benefit one species, most of the time, lots of species will also benefit from that. All right, and then I also mentioned, so if you think of the state of Nebraska, the very southeast corner, that's our home range for our southern flying squirrel. A little north of that, about an hour 15 minutes in Lincoln, we have had a lot of reports in the last few years that people are seeing southern flying squirrels here in Lincoln. This is not their native area. Did someone bring one and they escaped? Are they sugar gliders? We've had a few people that have sent in pictures and they have been sugar gliders, but we've also had a lot of confirmed that's a flying squirrel. So we do have periodic reports about people, especially residents in Lincoln. There's a landscaping crew on East Campus that found 4 of them in a tree, a hollow tree. They were taking it down and these little guys like popped their heads up, and the people taking the landscape crew taking that tree down, they're like, you're not a normal squirrel. So that was in December of 2021. That was here on UNL's East Campus. And then kind of since then, multiple other reports have been made around the city. It's kind of a speculation. Are they escaped pets? Are they increasing their range in the state? Is this a completely new population that we had no idea about? So our zoologist is testing genetics. They have a lot from the Lincoln area. And now what they're trying to do is get reference samples from the Nebraska City, kind of Indian Cave populations to compare the two. Are they genetically similar? Are they subspecies? Are they escaped pets? We don't know. So we're asking a lot of people to kind of help to do that. And how can you help? If you've seen a southern flying squirrel, like if you have a picture of one from the Lincoln area, you can email that to sean.dunn@nebraska.gov. And then also here's just kind of a little, I know this doesn't mean a lot if you're not in Lincoln, but here's a picture of our city. And these are all the little green dots of places that we for sure have had confirmed sightings of flying squirrels. So this is kind of like the southern area. If you're around the like Union College area, that's kind of the spot that people have been finding southern flying squirrels. So again, is this a completely weird new population that we never knew about? Are these escaped pets? Are people bringing them up from Nebraska City or Indian Cave State Park? We don't know. And it might take us a while to get those reference samples. But again, that's why you're going to see those nest boxes and those kind of traps, if you want to call them, at Indian Cave to get those samples. All right, so again, if you have a picture of one, some people don't know what to do with it. We've had a few people reach out on social media and say, hey, I have this picture. Do you guys want it? Do you care? What is it? And we're like, yes. So if you have a picture, know someone that has a picture of what they think is a flying squirrel, you can email that to Sean Dunn at nebraska.gov. Everyone that registers for these webinars will get an email from me the next day with the video links and everything. I can include that too. So if you're trying to write it down or you're trying to remember it, I will write that down. And if you need to share it with someone, please go ahead and do so. All right, so that was it for Southern Flying Squirrels. But we do have a few more coming up. So next Thursday, we're going to do science of smell. So how do different animals smell? What does their sense of smell look like? We'll talk about turkey vultures and birds and different types of animals like canines have really amazing sense of smell. And how do they do that? And how does that differ from other things? So, and then we're going to finish out with gar, bighorn sheep, and then also garter snakes. So we have a few more coming up. They're always on Thursdays from 3 to 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. And then each different webinar takes a different registration link. So I will send those out with my email here, probably either today or tomorrow. And then if you want more, if you really enjoyed this and you're like, gosh, I wish you would do a science of fungi. Well, I have, and there's a lot of different ones that you can check out. It's our Game and Parks Education YouTube channel, and then you can look up the playlist Science of. But we also have some Nature Nerd Night things. We have some nature journaling. We have some other kind of outdoor educational skill videos you can watch too. They're all free to check out. We have a pretty active wildlife education Facebook and Instagram page, and then also our wildlife education website that has downloadable activities, PowerPoints, information on educator workshops, just a lot of stuff that you can find. So thanks everyone. We will see you next week for Science of Smell. All right, so I think there are some things in the chat. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing. I'm gonna check out what people are saying here. Someone asked, why are they called flying squirrels? I think when people found things, they didn't know. We don't have the technology. We didn't have the knowledge that we do now. So even though they don't truly fly, they glide. People like, I guess, flying squirrel sounds better than gliding squirrel. It's kind of like the milk snake thing. People named them a milk snake because they thought that they drank milk from a cow's udder, but we know that that's utterly ridiculous. They don't do that, but the name just kind of stuck with them. So I think a long time when people found these animals, they didn't know what to do and like, oh, look, it's flying squirrel. We know that that's false advertising. They truly glide, but the name just kind of stuck with them. Someone already answered that. Thank you. Did they get genetic samples from live captured deceased or something else? Not sure, Michaela. It could be all three. I just know that they have been around this Lincoln area. So they're hoping then to get those samples from the Nebraska City, Indian Cave, Rulo Bluff area. So I think they're kind of just taking what they can get. So I'm not sure. That's a good question if they were alive, if they were deceased. Thank you. Good information. Does climate have impact on their movement further north? Good question, Mary. I assume that that would be a case for all species. The only thing I would say that might kind of hurt them as far as that is that it would just be that lack of trees. So Nebraska might kind of be that eastern range for them. Just because they need those mature hardwood trees and those deciduous trees. And kind of the more that we go through Nebraska, there's not a lot of those trees. So I'm not sure, but I would assume that climate has something to do with their movements or is going to have something to do with them, kind of like all species. Yeah. Thank you. Always enjoy your presentation. Thank you. Yeah, DNA could come from scat too. So, which might be harder to find than the actual animal, but if it's found, it can absolutely be used. Just like they do with the mountain lion surveys here in Nebraska, every 2 years of scat dog surveys, they will take information from, or genetics from the poop or the scat, and then they compare populations as well. All right. Well, like I mentioned earlier, if you got on late or if you'd like to share this with someone or watch it again, give me about 24 hours or so. I'll send you all that email with some links and some information, and then also the link for this video too. And then hopefully we will see all of you next week for smell. So, all right. Okay, someone said PBS has a program called Big Little Journeys on flying squirrels. That would be great. Thank you for doing that. I will try to look that up and I will send that in a link for everyone too. You can check it out. Thank you. All right. Have a great week, everyone. Stay safe. Stay warm. We'll see you.